US President Donald Trump walks back trade tariffs against Canada and Mexico. So, what's next? Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. It didn't last 48 hours. On Wednesday, US President Trump announced a pause on tariffs for auto parts, and on Thursday, a more comprehensive one for all goods from Canada and Mexico covered under the North American Free Trade Agreement. The move follows a fiery speech to Congress when he defended the imposition of tariffs. Nathan King has details from the White House.
The setting looked very presidential, but the speech was more like a campaign rally for Donald Trump. What was interesting about it is that basically he touched a lot of the cultural warrior themes they did on the campaign trail, but no real priorities when it comes to his legislative agenda. In fact, there was no real ask of Congress going forward, just a promise of a golden age for America.
6 weeks ago, I stood beneath the dome of this Capitol and proclaimed the dawn of the golden age of America. We have accomplished more in 43 days than most administrations accomplished in 4 years or 8 years, and we are just getting started.
And the Democrats, too, ditched the protocol of such meetings, refusing to walk through as the president made his way to the dais to make his speech. We had Al Green, the congressman from Texas, waving his cane too much and refused to sit down and was escorted out of the chamber, the Democrats holding signs up. It was quite a defiant speech that perhaps the Democrats playing into Donald Trump's hand. These speeches are very much domestically focused, but of course, with Ukraine, everyone very focused on what happened last Friday, just behind me here with President Zelensky leaving the Oval Office after that exchange with the President and the Vice President, the pausing of military aid, the cancellation of intelligence sharing, but Donald Trump saying he had a letter from Zelensky, he read part of it out. It didn't say sorry, but it wants to get things back on track. We hear that essentially Zelensky is ready to return to the White House. There's even talk of President Macron of France, Prime Minister Starmer of the UK accompanying him to try and get things back on track, whether it comes to a peace deal over Ukraine with Russia or just signing the minerals deal. A precarious moment for the world, but President Trump very much in his element, basking in his election win and control of both houses of Congress. Nathan King, CGTN at the White House.
It's time to bring in our guests. From Miami, Jadan Horyn is a political analyst. From Portland, Liang is chair professor in economics at Willamette University. Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University here in Washington, D.C. And in our studio, Douglas Sloan is principal of the National Capital Strategy Group. Welcome to all of you. Jadan Horyn, let's talk about that speech that President Trump made to a joint sitting in Congress. Now, he talked about tariffs there. He extolled the virtues of tariffs. He sang its praises. But as we just described, you know, those tariffs that were imposed against Canada and Mexico have now been withdrawn. It's all very confusing. The markets are very nervous, as we have seen. So what's going on?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is Donald Trump is looking to utilize tariffs as a point of leverage. There's a lot of rhetoric from Trump in relation to tariffs used to fund, revenues for or replacing income tax. But the reality is that there's one thing that has really been bothering Donald Trump, and that has been free trade deals, specifically NAFTA, and then obviously the replacement he renegotiated during his first term. And the result is that the maximum leverage campaign is designed to get certain objective things that the Trump administration wants. One of them is a more secure border, the moral and ethical issues related to fentanyl, and the culpability of both the Canadians and the Mexicans in respect to that and the deaths in the United States. But then there's other things, like whether it be dairy in Canada, whether it be imports of alcohol from Mexico, that are less headline grabbing, of course, but they're definitely items that this Trump administration is looking to, kind of get wins on, for whether they're ag producers or whether they're manufacturers here in the States. Now, the question is, of course, will that happen in a way that actually benefits the American people? Of course, that's open for debate. But what we're going to see is this back and forth, because they are a leverage point, and who blinks first is going to be the one who ultimately loses. And we know that with Donald Trump, he has no problem switching a position to 180 degrees the opposite within the same day in order to achieve a goal or objective that he thinks that he has.
Right, Jadan, if you say who blinks first, it looks like the president has blinked first, because he's withdrawn these tariffs that he imposed on Mexico and Canada. And as you point out, if it's a point of leverage, what has he achieved?
Right, and I think that's a very interesting point, right? We had the Commerce Secretary coming out and trying to walk back or soften the language, but at the same time, we have the Prime Minister of Canada, who, for whatever reason, obviously he has an election coming up, is taking a much different tack than the president of Mexico. He suggested to his countrymen to continue to boo the U.S. national anthem. He's taking a very bellicose and kind of I would deem kind of unwise positioning. And the blinking that's occurring on the part of the administration, or if that's the appearance of it, is certainly for public optics. Whatever's going on behind the scenes, I'm sure, is not all that friendly. I think the reception from the Canadians is not going over well in the United States. Definitely the reception of the Mexican president and how she has handled this is the way to do this. And that's why the tariffs on Mexico were delayed first. That's why the reimportation of the big three auto parts, Mexico was the primary part of that. Canada was secondary. And I think we're going to continue to see that. Likely we're going to see a splitting off over the next 30 days based on how these two leaders are addressing and dealing with President Trump.
Douglas Sloan, President Trump has been talking about tariffs for a very long time. I mean, he did this during his first term as well. I mean, he's always been saying that, look, it's going to be those countries that export to us that are going to be paying for this. But, tariffs, normally when they're imposed, it's the consumer in the United States who pays for it. The fact that other countries may be paying for it is only partly true if only those countries devalue their currencies or drop prices to maintain their market share in the United States. But the question is, can the Democrats make a bigger issue of this? Shouldn't they be fighting this more? Shouldn't they be getting their message across to the American consumer that higher tariffs means higher prices?
Absolutely. I think at this point, Democrats need a wholesale change in how they do things. I think they need to appoint a war chief that focuses on these types of issues. If it was up to me, I would have the Democrats running ads in purple states and swing states and battleground states right now, talking about what Trump said in his address when he was talking about tariffs. And if tariffs are so good, why does he keep rolling them back? Every time we turn around, it's like, oh, these tariffs are good. They're going to make us so much money. And then he rolls them back. And, we had tariffs with China in Trump's last term. And lo and behold, China enacted retaliatory tariffs that hurts our exports, that hurts our farmers. So obviously tariffs, and any economist will tell you that tariffs are a bad idea, that tariffs are going to hurt our economy, that consumers are going to have to pay the high price of tariffs, that countries are going to enact retaliatory tariffs. Canada can enact retaliatory tariffs on a number of things, including energy, car manufacturing, some really vital resources and markets to the United States economy that could really harm us. So just having Trump up here in the White House with all these executive orders and enacting tariffs and back and forth, we see what's happening with the stock market. We see people are now starting to feel the pinch with him slashing jobs at VA and threatening to do away with the U.S. Department of Education and cutting jobs in government. We're seeing that the Republican congressmen are going back home to their home districts and getting an earful at the town hall, so much so that now the Republicans are saying don't do town halls anymore. All of this is just added to this big bowl of mishegas where we see that Trump really doesn't know what he's doing.
One other point, Douglas, and that is, if, as you say, the Democrats need to get on a war footing right now, you need a strong, powerful, and loud leader for that, don't you?
I agree. I think that we have some people in the Democratic Party that can pull that off. I think that Hakeem Jeffries can start to really push us forward. I mean, quite frankly, it's not going to be hard. I think the what is it called? The Lincoln Republicans or the Lincoln Group. The name is escaping me right now. They've laid a blueprint of exactly what you need to do. They come out with commercials on YouTube, on social media every week, attacking Trump, attacking Republicans, attacking these policies. It's not rocket science. You know, there's a smorgasbord of material, target-rich environment of material that you can use to go after Republicans, to go after Trump, and start making those inroads now in those swing states, in those battleground states, because the midterms are going to be here before you know it.
That's right. That group that you're talking about, in fact, they had a very powerful campaign on television. It was almost totally confined to television. Okay, let's go to Yan Liang. Yan Liang, good to see you. Now, there are many countries, China as an example, as Douglas pointed out, who've taken retaliatory measures. They've imposed their own tariffs on imports from the United States. And when we look at, let's say, China and the United States and the level of trade that they do every single year, what impact are these tariffs going to have?
Well, good to talk to you, Anand. So we know that the tariff is basically a regressive tax. So really, the imposition of tariff and the retaliation will only produce lose-lose situations for both countries. Or in the case of U.S.-China, because these are the two largest economies of the world, I think the tariff spat between the two will really have global consequences. So you're right, the additional 20% tariff on China now are actually are in effect, unlike the ones in Mexico and Canada, they have been paused. But again, it's just a truce, right? So we still don't know what will happen by April the 2nd. But still, I think this tariff on China is going to, in a way, harm Chinese economy because exports does help to propel China's growth. But that said, I think China has been gradually reduced the reliance on the U.S. market, right? The U.S.'s market now only accounts for about 14.6% of China's exports. And then the net exports to the United States is only about 1.57% of the Chinese GDP. So when you look at the two sessions, the government has mapped out really sensible policies to bolster domestic demand, to again reduce the sort of the external shocks to China's economy. And then when you look at the U.S. economy, I think imposing these tariffs, for one, is going to disrupt the supply chain because China is really the sort of the key node of the global supply chain. And so that is going to hurt the U.S.'s manufacturing sector, its entire production sector, but also consumer goods, because we know this time around, these tariffs are going to affect many consumer goods, ranging from electronics to sports equipment to toys, you name it. And then the retaliation has been on the U.S.'s exports of the energies, and now in terms of the farm goods, right? So I think all of this are going to hit Trump's pain point and also affect the U.S. economy in a negative way in both of GDPs, but also in terms of inflation.
And very briefly, Young Liang, if we look at the figures from last year, China's growth was one of the main drivers of global growth. So could we see economies around the world be affected by this?
Well, China is going to continue to grow. The growth target this year is 5%. So again, it's possibly contributing to another, 28 or 30% of the global growth this year. So I don't think in that sense it's going to be a lot of negative impacts on China's growth and therefore the global growth. But that said, you will see disruptions in supply chains and changes in countries' strategies of trading and investing with each other. So that unnecessary uncertainty is going to drag down the global growth.
Anton, Fedyashin, what do you make of the Trump strategy of using tariffs to achieve seemingly unconnected foreign policy and national security goals? I mean, if you look at China and Canada as examples, I mean, he's imposed these tariffs ostensibly to prevent what he says are uncontrolled exports of fentanyl or fentanyl starters into the United States.
Right. So that's a bit like, subscribing to a credit card, spending as much money as you possibly can, and then blaming the credit card company for giving you the ability to do so. The United States certainly spends an enormous amount of money importing more than it exports. That's hardly the fault of the countries who produce the goods that Americans prefer to buy. Using tariffs in order to put pressure on countries to help the United States to fight the drugs coming into the country doesn't seem to be, to me at least, the smartest way to go about this, because it antagonizes the governments that are supposed to be helping you control the border. We'll see if this works out. In terms of the immigration flow from across the southern border, the strong arming that the Trump administration has threatened to use against Mexico actually has delivered some results, but because the flow has been reduced. But that's mostly because of the implementation of policies domestically. Although, yes, the Mexicans have sort of stepped up their efforts on their borders. But in the broader picture, Anand, look, tariffs are a softer version of sanctions. And as we've seen with the case of Russia and with the case of sanctions being used against other states, in the long run, they may damage and affect the economies of the targets. But in many cases, the blowback is much more severe than the intended consequences.
Dr. Liss, do you think there will be a tipping point at some point where these tariffs start really hurting American people, consumers?
Oh, I can imagine so. I believe the Prime Minister of Canada already threatened to cut off energy to the northern part of the United States. That could be catastrophic. Yeah. So it's wreaking havoc with the stock market. The stock market is down, although the Treasury rates went down yesterday, and people are happy about that. But that happened because the stock market tanked and people rushed to buy Treasury notes when that happened. So that pushed the Treasury note price up, the yields down, and now he's saying, oh, look, the Treasury rates went down, but that's not because they lowered the budget. That's because these tariffs are causing the stock market to tank, and thus investors are rushing to buy Treasury notes. So, yeah, there are plenty of ways just with retaliatory tariffs. We got a taste of it in his last when Trump's last term, when farmers really suffered with retaliatory tariffs from China on some of the grains that we were exporting. So we're really starting to see that, and that in conjunction with his new immigration policy, where he's really going after some of the undocumented immigrants that are kind of the engine to our economy to a great degree. That is hurting a lot of farmers, industry within not only the auto industry, but with some of our meats and slaughterhouses and in the farming industry. A lot of the workforce are simply too scared to go to work, and that is starting to take effect on this economy. So, yeah, we really are going to start to see a negative effect from some of these policies.
Okay, Jadan, I want to look at the whole speech that Trump made on Tuesday evening at Congress. I mean, it was one of the longest such speeches in history. It was about 100 minutes long. It was very partisan in many respects. He took shots at the opposition. What were your impressions? And in some ways, was it a missed opportunity on the part of the president to try and unite what is a very divided country right now?
I mean, I think the president said something really both ironic, funny, because, most people watching, knew that it was true. But that was that, he could announce a cure for cancer, and that the Democrats had already pretty much come to the conclusion that they weren't going to applaud anything. And, it doesn't really matter whether Trump seeks to unify, whether he's framed as a divider. He's come to the conclusion that Democrats aren't going to work with him, and Republicans control all three branches of government, and they're going to govern. yes, the speech was partisan. Yes, the speech also, represented the best of previous style speeches. The recognizing of people in the gallery was introduced by Ronald Reagan. These speeches were originally not even televised. There's a bit of theatrics and pageantry going on here, which is, of course, why the Democrats chose to be as divisive and as norm-shattering as possible, which, again, they understood the optics. They knew what they were doing. They have absolutely no regrets. But the American people walked away generally with a positive viewpoint. I think that's what's definitely not missed in the punditry, but is missed in the political takeaway, is that things like tariffs are marginally popular with the American people. They're overwhelmingly popular with the Rust Belt states, the states that have been hollowed out by free and unequal trade. And the idea that Trump would walk away from the things that and from the people whose support catapulted him back into the White House, is just not going to happen. Yeah. So last night was, I'm gonna poke my finger in the eye of the opposition because they're here doing that, and no matter what I do, they're not going to work with me. So I'm just going to point that out. And the American people had some laughs, they had some cringes, and mostly they were there for 90 plus minutes, 100 plus minutes, going, wow, this is a lot longer than Joe Biden.
Liang, a large part of that speech, of course, focused on tariffs, and the president also talked about how he's going to get manufacturing jobs back in the United States, that companies are going to be returning here. There was a poll that was done by CNN after that speech, which showed that 62% of Americans think that the president's policies will take the country in the right direction. What is your assessment of this country's economy right now?
Well, I think the Atlanta Fed just issued their projection for the Q1 of this year. The growth rate will contract by 2.4%. So I think that has a lot to do with the various policies, and also not only misleading policies, but also very high level of uncertainty due to these policy announcements. And I agree with the previous speakers. First of all, tariff is paid by the American consumers. It hurts the businesses. Immigration policies, the PIRE has crunched the number. If President Trump really deport 8.3 million undocumented immigrants by the end of his term, he is going to reduce the GDP by 7% compared to the baseline scenario. So a lot of these policies, not to mention his tax cuts, right? That is basically 1% of the population gets 20% of the benefits. The bottom 60 gets 13% back in 2018. And by 2028, if that policy gets extended, the rich 1% is going to get the great majority, 80% of the benefits. And so, and that's going to add, $8.3 trillion debt to the U.S. economy by 2028. So I think a lot of these policies are not conducive to the U.S. economy. And when you specifically talked about manufacturing, so what these tariff does is, again, disrupt the supply chain without a holistic policies to build infrastructure, to train the workforce, to make the energy more affordable and accessible. It is impossible to just use a tariff to be able to revitalize the manufacturing sector, not to mention to curtail some of these overwhelming financial interests that encourage outsourcing, offshoring, job cuts, and so on and so forth. So I think this is really just wishful thinking. It's also a lie, I think, to the electoral voters that somehow this tariff is going to bring back jobs. Not to mention, I think we also need to keep in mind that this country right now employs about 8% of the workforce in the manufacturing sector. Most of the people work in the service sector. So there's also the question, who are going to pick up some of these manufacturing jobs and who has a skill to do that? So I think, at the surface, yes, these policies seem to be able to convince some of the investors to come to the U.S. to invest. But again, when you really look down at the economic reality, these policies are not going to work for the U.S. economy, not with the working people.
Anton, Fedyashin, let's talk about the one big foreign policy issue that was addressed in that speech, and that is Ukraine. Of course, that speech came just a couple of days after that very rancorous, very ugly spat in the White House between President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Trump, as well as Vice President J.D. Vance. Things appear to have cooled down right now. There have been some talks, been some negotiations, and what we're hearing right now is that President Zelensky is prepared to sign that minerals agreement that President Trump wants. He wants to talk about peace. He wants to talk about a possible ceasefire. So where do you see it heading?
Well, I think we're going to witness an up and down roller coaster ride over the next few days. The latest news that I saw today is that there's going to be a meeting between an American and a Ukrainian group in Saudi Arabia. No representatives of the upper echelons of the administration from the United States will be there, but President Zelensky plans to go, and we'll see if that works out. I think that one can get lost in all of the details, the tactics of what's going on. But I think the overall picture is that we are witnessing the war termination phase in the Ukrainian conflict. The Trump administration views foreign policy as it does trade, essentially, as a zero-sum game. And they have come to the conclusion that the whole neocon project around Ukraine that the Trump administration inherited from the Biden administration is a loss in terms of money, a loss in terms of prestige for the United States, and they're simply extracting themselves from Ukraine. This, of course, is a catastrophe for the Ukrainians who essentially committed themselves to becoming a beneficiary of Western largesse. And now Ukraine's largest sponsor is turning away. And so the threats of suspending and the actual of aid seem to be producing results. It looks like the Ukrainians will start moving towards a peace deal, but the details are going to be worked out over the next few weeks and months.
Right. Jadan, I've got just a minute, in fact, under a minute left, but you do get the last word because it's your birthday. Happy birthday from us. The last word I want to know about, Jadan, is, President Trump has been in office for just over a month. It's been quite a month, a tumultuous month, to put it mildly. What are you expecting in the next few months?
Definitely, thank you. Thank you for the birthday wishes. I think what we're going to expect from President Trump is likely an acceleration, especially in relation to Israel and Hamas. We're going to look at an acceleration with a pressure campaign on the regime in South Africa. We're going to look at a pressure campaign on the EU in relation to a negotiated settlement with Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to North America, we're going to look at President Trump examining that the Arctic is about to open, and we either will have allies or we will have impediments in the Arctic. And it's going to be more of a roller coaster ride than most people expect.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington.